panel. We have three panel members who are John Schwedel from Verizon, Tsvetta Kaleynska, who's now a consultant and who formerly worked for a variety of software companies, including Brandwatch. We have Ben Greenberg, who's from McCann Health, and I believe all three of you are in the New York City area, which is a change from the people we've had before. Tsvetta, when people are able actually to see you, you're sitting on a terrace with a look over the city, so that's really cool. I'm going to stop screen sharing now. Oh, I will mention we did have a fourth panelist lined up who was actually going to moderate. That was Annie Melnick from Adidas in Germany. Annie had to drop out last week, so I am taking over as the moderator of this panel. So folks should be able to see all four of the panel members. Let's make sure that you are unmuted, which you are now. So why don't we just start by having you each introduce yourself in turn. Tell the people who are in the audience today who you are and what you do, keeping in mind, of course, that emotion, human data, and variety in its variety is at play here, but isn't the only thing that we're interested in. Why don't we start with you, Tsvetta?
Hi, that sounds good. Hi, guys. Nice to meet you all, though it's virtually. My name is Tsvetta Kaleynska, and I am a social media digital guru, or at least I like to think I am. I have been in the social space for over 12 years at this point. I have worked across various vendors, and I have been helping a lot of customers, both brands and agencies, optimize their digital efforts and campaigns online.
All right, and Ben?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Greenberg, and sorry, I think I'm on two different devices. 1 second.
You just muted yourself, Ben.
All right. Sorry about that.
I don't hear any feedback.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry about that. So I'm Ben Greenberg. I work for McCann Health. We're a global marketing and advertising agency. I work in the social sciences department. So I run our discipline that focuses on really understanding why people do the things that they do at their core. So emotion plays a really huge role in that. We work mostly with biotech and pharmaceutical clients in the healthcare space. So as you can imagine, empathy-driven marketing, as our global CSO likes to call it, is a very big part of what we do. And so my role is basically operationalizing emotional analysis, as well as many of our different tools across our different brands.
And John?
Hey, I'm Jonathan Schwedel. I used to work on the vendor side, but I've been at Verizon for over 6 years now. I've had a variety of roles tied to analytics. I've done a fair amount of work on social media, on survey responses with various survey platforms. Currently, I'm on our customer care analytics team, working on omni-channel projects related to analytics. We also run the speech analytics to Verizon, so I can provide a fair bit of color around that if it turns out we head in that area.
Yeah, great. So I'll mention that I've had John participate in past conferences, the Sentiment Analysis Symposium in New York, and I met him through a solution provider. In fact, I met all three of you through solution providers, but that's a topic that we'll get to a bit later. So of course, we did some preparation for this panel, a discussion about topics and themes that the panel members would like to discuss that we will discuss. We're going to try to make this a conversation. So I'm going to once again encourage the panel members to respond to one another if you have something to say. Why don't we start with data use, with use cases, goals and benefits, again, regarding emotion and empathy and human data within the enterprise, but understanding that those concepts don't stand on their own, that they're part of a much larger picture that involves operational considerations, analytics, design, all of those kind of things. Who wants to kick it off with comments about data uses, use cases, goals and benefits within the enterprise? Ben, you look like a likely subject, so I'm going to pick on you.
Not a problem. I'm not shy about talking, so happy to jump in anytime. So from a data utilization perspective, a lot of the ways that we utilize emotional analysis or emotional data is really throughout the entirety of the brand building process. So traditionally, we're working with, like I mentioned, biotech and pharmaceutical companies. And in doing so, we try to infuse, as you can imagine, empathy is a really critical driver across all of pretty much everything that we do, especially in the healthcare space. And so we pretty much try to instill it in everything that we do, from, the very core of who the brand is, the brand DNA, how they sort of, think, feel, and behave with regards to many different stakeholders, all the way through to our executions in terms of our tactics and the emotions that we're sort of trying to elicit in terms of actual engagements with our customers. So I just recently finished a project where we were actually trying to understand, I think I was trying to sort of wait until we got a little bit further down to mention COVID, but I just finished a project where we were looking at how doctors sort of in aggregate across the world have been reacting or changing their sort of emotional states and then afterwards their behaviors with regards to adapting to COVID. And so this was a huge emotional analysis project that we put together. Anyway, a really big emotional analysis project we put together that was analyzing data across all these different global countries, or all these different countries across the globe to get to that understanding. So very, very interesting project, and just infinite use cases I could talk about, but I'll stop there because that was a lot.
Additional takers?
Sure, I'll go ahead, and hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now. We have a lot of customer touch points and a pretty high customer volume because we're consumer facing. So there's a lot of use cases around the company. I'll stick with one that I've been working on recently. So I mentioned speech transcription. All the customers who call in for support with us, we do inform them that we record the calls, and we use them for a few use cases. We use them for coaching with our reps, but also just to get business intelligence to try to identify, why customers are calling, and then we can turn around and improve those discrete customer experiences. So specifically with regards to emotion, we've taken a fair amount of looks at, for instance, the tone and inflection, both of the reps and the customers, with various vendor solutions that we use. And we've been trying to see, okay, are there specific use cases that will cause a more emotional response, as well as can we tie those emotional responses to outcomes, whether that's just sentiment, the words that people are using, or things like their tone, how expressive they're getting. And there aren't a ton of specifics I can get into, but we think it's one factor among many that's useful for predictive purposes, and we're trying to build up that discipline a little bit more.
That was actually awesome, John, and thanks so much for giving me so much to kind of piggyback on, so to say. I've been in the industry for so long that I almost feel like I've worked on various use cases, and obviously different companies come with a different size of a use case, so to say. I have worked with across both use cases that Ben and John mentioned. I'm particularly going to use the example that John actually just used, which is the speech transcript. So a lot of the vendors and actual brands that I've worked with have been utilizing basically speech transcripts to understand if there are specific either products or actually call centers that are lagging or basically preventing the brand from being successful. That is what I would definitely say is beyond predictive analytics, and obviously emotion and sentiment plays a really big role in it. I have also worked across quite a few interesting use cases, in my opinion, which would be obviously Ben actually just mentioned one keyword, which I'm sure we might hear until the rest of the panel is over, but COVID-19, right? So social and emotion, especially during this time of year and probably this time of where the world is at, we are seeing more and more brands care about emotions and sentiments that has been basically triggered by this pandemic. So I could also mention a few more use cases, but I'd probably just stop there to see if the other panelists have anything else to add.
Yeah, I mean, so with regard to doing that work on COVID, something that's been sort of interesting for us, and this is again related to healthcare, but in that space, it's sort of been interesting to look at the global trends that happened a couple of years ago and sort of punctuate those time points because, you know, as with I think every sort of sector of the world, you know, there were trends that happened or that were happening already. And COVID sort of came in and sort of, you know, altered those in terms of where they were headed and actually did some not great things and some, in some cases, some things that we're finding some pretty interesting things in terms of, you know, physicians sort of across the board were, as far as the study went, you know, sort of trending towards this, this feeling of, you know, more security and sort of safety and confidence in sort of their existing way of doing things in a lot of ways because the healthcare system, you know, obviously as crazy as it is, sort of necessitates that. But because of COVID, a lot of them and their emotional states are sort of starting to trend towards you know, a mindset of innovation and a willingness to do that. And I think that, you know, that's from necessity because of the insanity that's happening. But it's sort of really interesting to look at that that emotional data over time and how it's sort of changed. So, you know, I don't know if you guys have, you know, have had any experiences in terms of looking at maybe not just COVID, but other related topics in terms of how those emotional trends have changed or any type of emotional trends data.
Trending. John, maybe this isn't exactly trending, but so looking at longitudinal data, how things change, trend, being able to extrapolate or project, in other words, to predict is really interesting. Are we at a state where one can take this data and do predictive or even prescriptive analytics? In other words, say, well, if you respond in a certain way, if you express your empathy, for instance, in a COVID or another crisis situation, it could be an individual crisis, in a certain way, then you can expect this kind of response, and maybe even use these technologies to prescribe, to suggest what kind of response a brand might have? Or is this pie in the sky at this moment?
More on the former, the earlier part of what you were saying. So for instance, in terms of prediction, we will use categorization of the conversations we have. So we know that when certain topics are brought up, the calls will go longer, or they're more likely to have a transfer or to have a repeat call later on. And we use that in our forecasting. And we're still pretty early in the process, but we have seen, at least directionally, we can give some guidance, you know, hey, we know that this is coming. And based on these past events, we think we're more likely to see an increase in call volume, for instance. So maybe we need to realign staffing. Now, there's not really the feedback loop between that and then our response towards customers, or what we would outwardly share with them. I think with all of that, it's really driven by we're trying to fix problems before they happen, which is easier said than done, as well as we're trying to push more self-serve tools. We're trying to push more digital interactions instead of, you know, assisted conversations with our reps. So in the future, ideally, we would try to maybe use some of that to try to, I guess, push the conversation to our preferred channels. But it's easier said than done at this point.
Predictive, prescriptive, linking what is understood to actual outcomes. Any thoughts? Other thoughts?
Well, I actually think that Jonathan expressed and mentioned something really important, which he sounded like he's a little bit more modest on how predictive that could be. And Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would definitely have to agree. In my time working for various vendors, I have worked with various, not only social media vendors, but also emotion and sentiment, so to say, technologies and startups. And what I found it difficult is to really think beyond the current state. And what I mean by that is we do have a lot of data that comes in. We have social channels and millions of websites, and we have all of the customer service basically transcripts that are available to brands. But how can we really make an informed decision based off of all of the data that we have? Given that I am foreign, so English is my second language. Thinking how we talk when we talk in different channels is probably a little bit different. So can we really predict and make good assumptions as a brand that would be safe and would not really harm the way that we are approaching customer service, for example, or we're thinking about the future? I don't know. So I'd probably agree with John that I am a little bit more moderate in terms of my view on this topic, but I'd love to obviously hear from the rest of the panelists. And not only that, but I do encourage the people who are listening to chime in the chat, as we'd love to hear more from your point of view.
With respect to what you said, I think some of the challenges, internally, there are people who have kind of an omni view. We know that a certain data source, social might be better for a certain use case, surveys might be better for a certain use case. But generally, there are all these silos, and for the most part, they stick with what they have. So just in terms of internal structure and communication, that's one of the biggest impediments to getting more of that unified view that would enable those predictive insights that you speak of. And that's something, as clients, we need to sort of be honest about when we're thinking about different vendor solutions or different, agencies we might work with. You have to be conscious of that and what is feasible.
And I'm sure Ben has probably a lot to add to that, especially from agency side and the type of industry that you're in, given all the restrictions and the specific compliances that you have to also go through.
Yeah, I wasn't going to bring up CRC, but I guess I can. So absolutely, it's even more difficult when you when you add in HIPAA compliance and things like that. So very difficult for us to do something like that, but also sort of an area that's ripe for opportunity. So if you think about where the healthcare system has sort of gone, patient satisfaction has actually become a critical factor and is actually driving some reimbursements for hospital systems. So if you think about how difficult it is to sort of quantify patient satisfaction, you can imagine how perfectly a fit emotional analytics or AI-based emotional analysis tools could actually fit there. And so part of the McCann Health Network is actually focused on specifically our sort of managed markets side of things. And so we have actually been sort of chatting about what would be an interesting way to sort of use some of our vendor partners with regards to emotional analytics to actually quantify and create a testable model for patient satisfaction. So definitely relevant for us, but as you said, very hard, definitely hard.
Yeah, so I've had a few vendors pitch me along those lines, and I'll share with everyone what's my mindset when someone like Ben might approach me, whether it's a vendor, whether it's an agency. At a technical level, on an analytical level, it's great. These are really cool technologies. What's challenging is A, finding a use case, and B, when you think about what I'm being asked for internally by my stakeholders, for the most part, their requests aren't especially complex. There's that whole 80-20 rule. Most of them, they just want something pretty standard and something as quick as possible. So I like having these meetings with vendors and agencies so I know what the capabilities are, and maybe I'll tuck it away for a time in the future. But I have those sort of one-off things, and then I have these ongoing projects like our speech analytics, which we're pretty in depth with our vendors there, and it's very deep. So you don't have a ton in the middle.
So we've had data questions here, and we've had vendor questions. We've talked in passing about modeling. In a way, some of the earlier speakers talked about this more, about the model effectiveness, and we have touched on cultural issues. Those can be very difficult. But it does take vendors, and we've alluded to that, to actually make this reality, to make it usable, whether it's in an operational setting like a contact center, as John mentioned, whether it's a matter of studying patient satisfaction in order to try to improve all of that. Now, I actually have met each of you through vendors. I have no problem with naming names. People shouldn't take these as endorsements. John, I first met you through Clarabridge, which is a customer experience vendor, quite a few years ago. I don't recall when, but I'm guessing it might be 8 or even more years. Ben, you were connected to me by Lana Novikova, who runs something called Heartbeat AI, heartbeatai.com in Toronto. I advised her company around 4 years ago as a consultant. And then Tsvetta, you and I met through Brandwatch, where you worked for a while. So the question here is, how effective are the commercial solutions on the market if you have the right kind of data? For that matter, you each work with data scientists, how effective can it be to build models and potentially explore deploying them with open source or data mining type of text analysis, voice analysis type workbenches? So what's the state of play of the market for solutions that make effective use of data? Who wants to take a shot at that?
I'd be happy to. So the state of the market is actually pretty developed. Without trying to mention any names of vendors, because I am very much tool agnostic, I would say that if a brand or obviously an agency has the right types of data sources, they could definitely be very, very effective in achieving that. Of course, that depends on budget, because we know that data is very expensive, especially this time of the world and where we are. Data is extremely expensive, and it's getting more and more expensive as more regulations and more regulatory kind of arms start reaching into that. So I do think that as long as the right people, so the right data scientists and the right kind of view is taken and is into effect with data mining, that could be achieved. I think one of the hiccups and issues that we do face quite often, especially in the work that I've had with clients, is, as John mentioned earlier, very often the work of some teams is siloed. So if there's no open communication and no really understanding of how many vendors do we have, what data sources are we bringing in, are we using APIs, are we, how are we basically creating those models? I think that is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I think that, again, I'm just going to be a broken record about like in healthcare. So in health, I think the data sources are obviously, like I mentioned, additionally sensitive. So it does present a big challenge, but what we have actually been able to do with, as you mentioned, Heartbeat is, with regards to modeling, the taxonomy that Heartbeat has created is obviously significantly evidence-based and is just honestly beautiful to look at. Lana's very, very open about sort of sharing that. She's a wonderful partner. So in working with them, what we've actually started to do is build a custom taxonomy or custom model for healthcare, because what we found is that when we get down into the nitty-gritty of sentiment analysis, emotional analysis, and we use whatever data source it may be, whether that's data that we pull from social media or things like that. The more targeted and specific that data is, right? So any data that's directly gathered from interactions with physicians or patients, they're oftentimes using language that's very specific. And so what we've actually been able to do with Heartbeat is build that custom taxonomy that is really, really specific to health, that we sort of use in a proprietary way to get an even more accurate understanding of the emotional connection between, or the emotional connection between the words that are being spoken and obviously their emotions. So it's been, as far as vendor solutions go, to your question, I think that they're very amenable to sort of getting to the places that we need to go right now. But obviously there's always room for continued improvement.
Other perspectives?
Sorry?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mentioned I've been both on the vendor and the client side. So I think that helps somewhat with, we've run a fair number of RFPs. And what's always the challenge there is what might be a core use case for one client is an edge case for another. So I totally get, the prioritization queue in terms of product development on the vendor side. That's always a challenge. We always have a challenge with just our sheer scale. And, we certainly see a fair number of vendors look interesting, but operationally it'd be pretty disruptive to switch them for the incumbent, even if, technically they might be superior. When I think of all that, though, I kind of separated that in my mind from like modeling and advanced analytics, because typically all of our data scientists, for the most part, they'll use open source tools, or they'll use, platforms like, R, SAS, Python, et cetera. I don't think they're doing anything that I would characterize as, something you could publish a paper on, but we're kind of like applying just these standard techniques to our use cases. It's just, our volumes are pretty high, so there are lots of logistical issues. And of course, things like you're building your categorization, your sentiment, et cetera, for your specific data set. So sorry, I think those are kind of two separate questions in my mind.
Well, it is a notion that there is no, and there's not going to be any one-size-fits-all solution there, that you might have to find different solutions to handle different data sources in an optimal way, to handle different languages even. It's well understood that for language models, whether for speech or for written text, that the resources available for English are, it's out ahead there. Then you get mostly Western European languages and Chinese perhaps and Japanese that follow. And then you have a lot of lesser resource languages. We do have capabilities that could possibly include transfer learning. That's been alluded to a few times. One of our speakers this afternoon, Yasin Benachipa, is going to talk a bit about transfer learning to take models and adapt them for particular usage. That can happen with languages as well. So we understand that we're working in a very complex world and trying to model it effectively. And sometimes when you narrow the problem and you do particularize it to certain cases or uses, then you can really get there. I do remember, John, going to visit you in your office maybe 4 years ago at this point, and you had something like 9 or 10 different software applications that people you worked with and you yourself were using, and the question was how to rationalize them and reduce costs, and some of those software tools you were using, because they did give you access to particular data. So we did have one question that was related to those use cases. I will invite any of you to say anything more about the use cases that vendors would find useful to respond to your needs. In other words, can you articulate any more about use cases that would help the different solution providers and data providers better meet the needs that you're encountering? Anyone want to take a go? Okay, maybe I talked a bit too much there and kind of answered.
I mean, so with all of that, like for instance, take the speech analytics space, and I'm sorry I keep going back there, but there are a few big players, and I'd say all of them have pretty distinct, strengths and weaknesses. I won't get into the specifics, but like, look up a Forrester or Gartner report, and it's kind of all there, and that's all directionally correct. So for instance, if I'm using a certain vendor just because I know they all have strengths and weaknesses, but this is the one thing I can't live without, although I'm really annoyed by this other vendor does this other functionality better. Like for instance, there's one big vendor where it's pretty difficult to reprocess historical data. There's another vendor who just doesn't scale pretty well in terms of volume. So that's always a consideration. And you can sort of apply that abstractly to other areas, you know, in the space like social, I think.
We had a question from, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say I was kind of quiet because the use case doesn't really apply to me. I am normally the person who comes in and slates all the vendors and says, you know, which ones should really stay and which ones should really go. And as an Eastern European, I'm pretty cheap when it comes to stuff, so I come with a big slate. So that's why I was quiet. But you know, to John's point, it is pretty important to consider the number of vendors and also the number of support that they bring to the table and how flexible they could be with things such as reprocessing, because let's be realistic, in every single use case that you know, any client would have, there will always be a need for additional support, and I would assume that from vendor end that should come as, you know, as a given, really.
100% agreed. I was going to say use cases are pretty client dependent for us, so totally agreed with that point. That's why I'm also pretty quiet.
Well, we all know that we are years away from generalized AI that can handle so-called open domain problems without specificity going into it. We had a question from Jacqueline Gordon relating to the current COVID-19 situation about brand difficulties and challenges relating to authenticity. Sounding like you really care. I suppose it's best if you really do care, but brand authenticity, any thoughts on this?
I can start with that one. So as far as brand authenticity goes, I think that especially in the healthcare space, what we have sort of been seeing is that brands are looking for both ways to alter sort of what they're saying as well as what they're doing. So I think, you know, the place where emotional analysis has sort of played a really crucial role for us is understanding the emotional state that people are in and sort of tying that directly to their behavior and their decision-making and their decision-making abilities. So, you know, the discipline at McCann Health, social sciences, is dedicated to understanding sort of the unconscious drivers of decision-making, and sort of that includes, you know, the affect heuristic, as well as every other type of heuristic that's driving people. So emotions and sort of the other factors that are driven by unconscious, or other behaviors that are driven by unconscious factors. So in terms of what brands are sort of, or what the needs are, it's both what brands are saying and how they're saying it to sort of tailor their communications at this moment and their tactics to what do people need and what things do we need to do in order to create the emotional states where people feel, you know, safe enough or certain enough or something like that to take action. That may have been something that they weren't comfortable with taking before, which is, again, sort of going back to our first statement, which is, you know, people hate uncertainty and generally tend not to make decisions or take action in those moments. And so right now, a lot of health stakeholders are in a situation where they sort of don't have a choice just based off of the situation. And I think one of my favorite quotes is, you know, crisis begets innovation, which is really true. So we're trying to help brands sort of weather that storm.
Others? Okay, we had a question from.
Sure, I was just going to give her a chance. So I spent a few years in our market research department, so it's something that it's probably one of the biggest topics that Verizon marketing looks at. And it's a pretty big challenge because the way we see it, you know, for instance, we compare ourselves with Apple all the time. And even though the new iPhone might be, let's say, $1,200, generally customers have a much better perception of Apple as opposed to us, where we're seeing like a utility, like, oh, I have to pay all this money to Verizon each month. I don't really have a choice. And to some extent, it's hard to get around that. We're trying to improve brand perception. We're trying to improve our value proposition. But really, it's a very difficult field to win in. But most you can do is just try to avoid mistakes. So we're trying to be proactive about, you know, giving people a break if they're having financial difficulties right now, about, you know, frontline healthcare workers, teachers, giving them discounts, making sure underserved communities might get the equipment they need, for working at home and school from home and so on. But it's very difficult.
And Jacqueline's question is very interesting and very valid at this point. So I don't know per se there's a right answer because I do know that right now every single brand has to respond, and if they don't, they basically have missed the train of opportunity. So, without showcasing that you really care about your customers, especially during these times when people are losing their jobs and they're losing loved ones as well, it's really hard to be successful. In terms of how authentic they are, to be honest with you, just thinking about what an uncertain time this is in reality and how many people have been impacted by this, I do really think and I do believe that brands really care because they do care about their customers, and obviously they do care about their revenues as well. So I would probably say authenticity wise, we do see that brands are very much caring about their audience.
So we have another question from Manny Van, and maybe this can be tackled quickly and then we'll wrap up. The question is, in addition to working with large vendors, are enterprises open to collaboration with startups and market and brand thought leaders? How do people reach you if they're not a large established vendor, or reach the people you work with? John, you get pitched a lot.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. In all honesty, dealing with our supply chain and sourcing is extremely difficult. It's like dealing with the government. If I was a vendor, I probably wouldn't want to work with us. There are, people who are the decision makers. They'll go to conferences and just sort of see what's out there, but you kind of keep a skeptical eye at all times because you're approached and pitched by everyone under the sun. Sometimes those people aren't the decision makers. Sometimes the decision makers are senior executives, and they're reading things like Forrester and Gartner, for instance. It's very difficult, and your odds just aren't great. I can't give you any better thoughts than that.
From the agency side, I get reached out to on LinkedIn. I would say probably 4 times a day. And then through word of mouth, just from existing vendors. So, I think either one of those channels, sort of, being a part of the community is super helpful. So there's definitely a willingness to sort of try and do new things on the agency side. It's just a matter of like how crazy our schedules are that week. So that's pretty much, I guess, as much as I can sort of say. I hope that's helpful.
And I mean, I am the person who probably reaches out to people. So the best advice, echoing what both John and Ben mentioned, is LinkedIn for sure. And also I would say your network, leveraging your network. That's probably the best advice I could share.
Yeah, so we recognize
the only thing, I'll just add, be specific. So for instance, I'll have like random IT companies approach me and I'm not going to be able to do anything with that, as opposed to if it's in my area, I'll at least look at it.
Yeah, so we do recognize that a huge amount of innovation comes from independents like Tsvetta, from startups, and often commercialized academic research, but not always. In my own area, there's some great startups, for instance, natural language processing, Spacey in Berlin, Hugging Face that's located in Brooklyn and around the world. And we have to be open for innovation. Let's take one final question for very brief summative responses from our panel members. Where are things going? The technology industry, your own work, where are things going? Want to start that off, Ben?
Certainly. So more and more, I think there was a speaker at South by Southwest that a colleague of mine attended who said emotions are a brand's greatest asset. And I think that that lesson is sort of being driven home further and further. So I think the first place is emotional analysis being operationalized into most companies. I feel like that's definitely where we're headed. And then in terms of like the next step, or I think the next like most important step would be to start tying that in a more, if not predictive, a more I would say a clearer way of tying that emotional data specifically to behaviors. I know that that's a very significant part of some of the work that we're doing. And I think that that's sort of a really important next step for some places. I'm totally recognizing that some places are probably 10 times as far as we are, but that is definitely a really critical next step for, at least for us.
Next steps, futures, Tsvetta?
Happy to share my thoughts on this, and I definitely agree with everything Ben said. I think right now I'm thinking about data and predictive analytics and emotion and sentiment through the lens of specific work that I've been doing, which is very much government related. So I do all the time think about what's going to happen to data and data sources in the next 5 to 10 years, and how much regulation there will be on those. So how will brands and agencies be affected in terms of the number of data points that could be crawling, and obviously what platforms they come from. So I think that's where my head's at the moment. I do hope that I am wrong, and that we'll continue to evolve together with more data and really big data and predictive analytics. But yeah, I think that summarizes my view at the moment.
My perspective has changed a little bit in the past few years, just looking at our use cases and our interaction with different vendors and agencies. I think new functionalities are great and people like me get very excited about them, but for the most part, we don't have a lot of opportunities to use them. And for the most part, people like me aren't the decision makers. We're kind of like facilitating and sort of making the trains run on time once the decision has been made. So in terms of pitches to clients, I think there needs to be a little bit of a shift in emphasis towards, this is how you can be more efficient. This is how you can save money and achieve operational savings. That's probably more, that'll at least get more of an ear from what I've seen, because I don't have a ton of demand internally for new functionalities. And as unfortunate as that may be, but I definitely have people saying, hey, can we speed this up, or can we, remove this process and do this cheaper? So, and we don't know what'll happen economically, but if everything ties to COVID drags on a bit, you could definitely see some acceleration in that front, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's wrap up there. So thank you to our panelists. Didn't mean to show that. I meant to show something else. This is our next speaker, actually. So there's inevitable that one is going to fumble something, which I just did. Let's go back to sharing this. Thank you to our panelists, John from Verizon, Tsvetta from Rila Global Consulting, and Ben Greenberg from McCann Health.